Lupin ZERO was not an anime that I expected to be released in 2022. After Lupin III Part 6, things were quiet on the Lupin front, at least for a while. In fact, I think I heard about Lupin III vs. Cat's Eye before I heard about Lupin ZERO, even though Lupin ZERO came out first. Also, don't worry, I'll be making a video about Lupin III vs. Cat's Eye in the near future if you're interested. Of course, after I heard about Lupin ZERO, I was interested in it. It is still Lupin after all, but I still wasn't sure if I would like it. It's only 6 episodes, it has Lupin as a child, and I didn't know how I would feel about that. On top of that, it doesn't even have 3/5 of the cast. There is no Goemon, Fujiko, or Zenigata. Basically, would Lupin and Jigen be able to carry the anime by themselves? Not only is the short answer to that question yes, but this entry in the Lupin series does a fantastic job of balancing and combining the serious and dark side of the Lupin III series with the silly and goofy side of the series. Before we get into all that, what exactly is Lupin ZERO? Lupin ZERO follows a young Arsène Lupin III before he earns the title of Lupin III. The young Lupin longs to be a thief, and while at a nightclub, he strikes up a conversation with a kid his own age who happens to be there, none other than a young Daisuke Jigen. At first, Jigen wants nothing to do with him, but when the two of them have to work together to help a nightclub singer named Yoko, the two soon become thick as thieves. Generally speaking, from a character point of view, Lupin ZERO shows how Lupin and Jigen meet and how they eventually become friends. It also shows a bit of what drives Lupin to become a thief and how he eventually acquires the title of Lupin III. The anime also gives a proper introduction to characters like Lupin I and Lupin II. Lupin I was always hinted at, but there wasn't much about Lupin II, except for some flashbacks I think in Lupin III Part 2. Anyway, both are unique characters to say the least. As I said, beloved characters like Goemon, Fujiko, and Zenigata are missing from Lupin ZERO, but some of the new characters sort of fill their roles, but have things about them that make them stand out. The most obvious one is Yoko, who looks a lot like Fujiko and is something of a love interest for Lupin here. Lupin is much younger than her, she treats him like a child for the most part, and you can maybe see Lupin developing his preference for women. However, she is at a very different stage in her life and is in love with someone else. Shinobu seems to fill the stoic expert role that Goemon usually portrays, but she's also the family maid who looks after Lupin while his father is away. And speaking of Lupin's father, Lupin II, I thought he brought some of the wackiness that Zenigata often does to the anime, but he's clearly not an officer of the law. While these characters have similar traits to those other main characters in the Lupin series, they don't feel like carbon copies. They have a sense of similarity, but they also bring something different to the table. Throughout these 6 episodes, there is an overarching narrative involving Yoko, but a big takeaway from this anime is the friendship it establishes and builds between Lupin and Jigen. It's something that's been on display for decades, but it was nice to see their ups and downs as they first became friends. We even get a little bit of Albert in Lupin ZERO. If you're unfamiliar or don't remember him, Albert first appeared in Part 5 and later in Part 6. And here in Lupin ZERO, we get to see where his grudge against Lupin first forms. As I mentioned before, this anime does an excellent job of balancing the 2 major tones that the Lupin III series usually has. It either has a dark and serious tone, like in The Woman Called Fujiko Mine, or it's much more comedic, like in part 2. However, I felt that Lupin ZERO was able to strike a nice balance between the two. An episode that is a good example is episode 3, the grandson of the first vies for succession. This episode has violence and even some nudity, and while the traps that Lupin and the other characters have to deal with are dangerous, those traps are also very wacky and seem to be based on games like Twister and Simon Says. There is also episode 4, Claim the Whiskey Pipe. It's a ridiculously absurd concept about a secret underground pipe filled with whiskey used by US soldiers. Without going into too many spoilers, there's a point of the episode where there is a cartoony river of whiskey. Now that might have gotten some of you excited, but I think it's fair to say that it's a ridiculous concept. Just pure fantasy. There are darker aspects to this episode as well, but again, also shows Lupin and Jigen slowly becoming better friends. These 6 episodes just do a fantastic job of balancing the serious aspects of the Lupin the Third series with the fun. Lupin ZERO captures the different tones of the Lupin the Third series and combines them really well. Another thing that Lupin ZERO does really well is the music. It borrows a lot from the music of part 1, the opening, the ending, and even some of the background music will sound familiar if you've ever seen Lupin the Third Part 1. The music gives off a retro vibe and makes you feel like the anime is set in the past. Some of you may remember that during my retro review of Lupin the Third Part 1, I was a bit critical of a certain background song. Fortunately, the song in question, titled Nice Guy Lupin, doesn't seem to have made the cut here in Lupin ZERO. If you want to know more about that song and my thoughts on Lupin the Third Part 1, check out the retro review. That reminds me, speaking of the ending animation, is this the first time that a Lupin TV anime hasn't featured Fujiko in the ending animation? If not, it's certainly been a while. It makes sense that she's not in the ending animation because, well, she's not in Lupin ZERO. The anime, and by proxy the ending animation, focuses on Lupin and Jigen. But I was just curious if the series had ever not had Fujiko in an ending before. Let me know in the comments because I generally don't know. I really enjoyed Lupin ZERO overall, but I had a minor problem with the animation. I thought this entry in the Lupin series did an excellent job with the animation for the most part, especially the cars and vehicles. In part 6, they resorted to using 3D models for the cars in some scenes, and they never looked quite right. I believe they're using 3D models for the vehicles here in Lupin ZERO as well, but they look much better. My problem with some of the animation is that there are some background animated characters, essentially extras, that are just plain bad. They are way off model and look like they are from a different anime entirely. Lupin ZERO probably could have gotten away with it if it didn't focus on them, but there are a handful of times when it does, and it takes me out of the anime for a bit. I would feel immersed in the world and the characters, and then a scene like this would happen, and it would take me a little bit of time to sink back in and get immersed again. Again, I really enjoyed Lupin ZERO overall. I wouldn't mind at all if we got more and continued Lupin and Jigen as kids. I also wouldn't mind if we got a Goemon ZERO, a Fujiko ZERO, or even a Zenigata ZERO, following them as kids before they meet Lupin. I think there are some fun and interesting stories that could be told with those characters long before they meet Lupin. We could see what sets them on the path that eventually leads to them meeting Lupin. I think that would be cool to see. If you haven't seen Lupin ZERO yet, I think it's definitely worth checking out, especially if you're a fan of the older Lupin series. Despite being influenced by the earlier series, Lupin ZERO presents its characters in a new light. We get to know a little more about a young Daisuke Jigen, but also 3 generations of Lupin. The first, the second, and of course, Lupin the third. If you have seen Lupin ZERO, feel free to let me know what you thought of it in the comments. Also, you can follow me on Mastodon and Odyssey, links are in the description. And as always, thanks to these patrons for their continued support. I've been Anime Visor, thanks for watching, and see you later.